Thank you for joining our Debbie Stream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer webinar on the role of clinical trials for cancer patients. Clinical trials are the primary means by which new cancer treatments are developed, tested, and approved. In this webinar, you will learn why a clinical trial may be right for you, understand the different phases and common terms used in clinical trials, and hear tips on talking to your doctor about your clinical trial options. I am Mary Margaret Kilmeyer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I am the Patient Resource Manager for Debbie Stream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and currently completing my doctorate. My clinical and research background is focused on working collaboratively with doctors, patients, their families, and members of a healthcare team. We would like to thank Genentech for providing funding to make this webinar possible. We would also like to thank our promotional partners, the Anti-Cancer Club, Cure Magazine, Meals to Heal, and Patient Resource. You will be able to ask questions during today's presentation. You can type your question into the white text box that appears on your screen. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will address questions as time allows. If we don't have time to address your question, we will try to address it during our next webinar, taking place on March 11th at 12 noon Eastern Time. In addition, the recording of this webinar will be accessible on our website in approximately 1 week. Now I will introduce Debbie Zellman, who will share with you her journey and information about the Debbie Stream Foundation. Then Dr. Joel Tepper will present the role of clinical trials for cancer patients, and then there will be time for a question and answer session at the end. I would like to now introduce the president and founder of Debbie Stream Foundation, Debbie Zellman.
Good afternoon, everyone, or morning or evening, depending upon your time zone that you're listening to this. So welcome again. I am president and founder because I was diagnosed in April of 2008 with stage 4 stomach cancer. At that time, I was 40 years old, the mother of 3 young children. I was married to a physician, and I was a practicing attorney with my own firm. I was very healthy. I had no risk factors for the disease, and I had very vague symptoms. Upon my diagnosis, however, I was told that there were few treatment options. The latest treatment that they had was several decades old, and therefore my chances of being alive in 5 years was only 4%. However, a year later, I was still fighting and responding to the chemotherapy that I had been given. And I decided to help others who were not as fortunate as I am. And so I founded Debbie Stream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer in April of 2009. I am still a patient. People don't realize that I still receive an IV chemotherapy called Herceptin every 3 weeks, and I take an oral chemo every night called Tepper. In fact, last year I had 2 recurrences. I received a different chemo and radiation for one of my recurrences and switched up to the Tepper for the second recurrence. I am fortunate to serve as a patient advocate and a voice on the National Cancer Institute's Esophagogastric Task Force that oversees clinical trials for the NCI. I'm also a patient advocate for the NCCN Gastric and Esophageal Guidelines Committee. As an advocate, I also serve as a member of the Deadliest Cancers Coalition and a member of PEAK for the Patient Equal Access Coalition and SPEAK, which is the state version of that, as well as on One Voice Against Cancer. And a lot of people tell me that most notably, I appeared on Dr. Oz in an episode about stomach cancer. Next slide. So some of the scary facts about stomach cancer is that stomach cancer is one of the leading causes of cancer death worldwide, second in men and fourth in women. And most people don't realize that. In America, about 22,000 people will be diagnosed with stomach cancer. I believe the numbers for 2015 is projected to be 24,000, and more than 11,000 people will die. Really scary is that stomach cancer is on the rise in the United States in young people ages 25 to 39, and the cause for that is unknown. Another scary statistic is that per cancer death, stomach cancer receives the least amount of federal research funding of any cancer. And as I said before, there are few resources and support services for stomach cancer patients, except for Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. And most people know very little about this deadly disease. Next slide. So Debbie's Dream Foundation, what are we doing? Why are we here? We are here to make a difference for all the reasons I just stated. We are here to raise awareness about stomach cancer, advance funding for research both directly and indirectly, meaning going to Washington, D.C., and we're also providing education and support internationally for patients, families, and caregivers with, of course, the ultimate goal to make the cure for stomach cancer a reality. And please do visit our website at www.debbiesdream.org. There's so much available there. And in fact, this webinar will be stored there after. Next slide. So many milestones that we've achieved at Debbie's Dream Foundation. We have events all across the United States, as well as chapters in the United States, Canada, and Germany. 21 chapters are in the U.S., 2 in Canada, and 1 in Germany. We also hold free stomach cancer education symposia each year, as well as webinars like this one. We have a free patient resource education program called PrEP, where we help hundreds of patients, families, and caregivers throughout the world. We match the inquirer, whether it's a family member, the patient itself, him or herself, or a caregiver or friend or loved one. We match them with another stomach cancer survivor or caregiver using specific disease criteria, including stage, biomarker, age, gender, etc. We've also done research grant funding. We've done 3 specific $50,000 Young Fellowship Awards in conjunction with the AACR. We've also gone to Capitol Hill. Those 2 visits we've had have been very effective. In fact, we were successful in adding stomach cancer to the Department of Defense peer-reviewed cancer research program, and we were able to get that pot of money increased from $25 million to $50 million. That's going to be huge for stomach cancer researchers. Our next Advocacy Day is March 5th, 4th through 5th, and you can please join us and register on our website for that. And again, just referring to our website, there's so much in-depth material on the website about stomach cancer. There's a lecture library, there's clinical trial information, there's a matching service for clinical trials, there's a support community, which is a one-of-a-kind type of community. Please join that. There are blog topics and many other resources, and our website is translatable into more than 60 languages. Next slide. This is just a view of the homepage of the website. And it includes, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, a free stomach cancer brochure that anyone can request and receive that brochure. It's a wonderful source of information. Next slide. Here's a listing of some of our upcoming events, including our Night of Laughter in South Florida on February 8th. That's this Sunday. As I already mentioned, the Capitol Hill Advocacy Day coming up on March 4th and 5th. Our symposium and our gala on April 18th. The symposium can be attended in person in Fort Lauderdale or via webcast. It's available all over the world. And our gala, we celebrate at night all of our accomplishments. We'll have many more events. These are just a smattering of a few that we have coming up. In addition, we have an International Stomach Cancer Genes Day every year in November, which is Curing Stomach Cancer Month. And we also have a team that always runs in the Miami Marathon. We just had 85 runners a few weeks ago, and the next one will be in January. Next slide. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to our host, Mary Margaret Kilmeyer. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Debbie's Dream Foundation is headquartered in Davie, Florida. Our office is open from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. On this slide, you will see important phone numbers and email addresses to contact our office. We will start the presentation on clinical trials for the cancer patient. Our presenter is Dr. Joel Tepper. Dr. Tepper is the Hector McLean Distinguished Professor of Cancer Research at the University of North Carolina. He received his undergraduate degree from MIT and his MD from Washington University, St. Louis. Dr. Tepper has been a senior investigator at the National Cancer Institute and an attending physician at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Tepper has been at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill for the past 25 years as chair for the first 20 of those years. Dr. Tepper has been an active participant in research in gastrointestinal tumors for many years, holding several positions of distinction with the National Cancer Institute, and served as a board member for the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the Clinical and Translational Research Advisory Committee. At this time, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Tepper, who additionally is a member of the W. Stream Foundation Medical Advisory Board. Dr. Tepper, thank you for joining us.
Hello? Can
Hi,
you hear me?
I hear you. Yes, thank you
Okay.
for
I've
audio.
had a lot of troubles before.
Yes, audio difficulties settled just in the nick of time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So I'm just going to go through and discuss some of the issues related to clinical trials, try to give an overview of what clinical trials are and how one should think about them. Next slide. So what is a clinical trial? Well, a clinical trial is really a formal approach in which physicians try to answer a question related to a disease by studying patients or something about patients. So doing experiments on mice or on cells is not a clinical trial because it is not in patients. And doing a new procedure on a patient is not a clinical trial unless it is designed in a specific way to really answer a specific question. So just doing something new is not a trial. That's just trying something new. Next slide. So what are some of the characteristics of clinical trials? And these can be a little bit of variation. These hold true pretty much across the board. And first of all, there needs to be a formal document, what should we call a protocol, which it's a written document that defines all the issues related to the clinical trial. And these include a number of factors, including, first of all, really a one or maybe two-sentence statement of what specific question the investigators are trying to answer. This is usually framed in terms of an hypothesis, and it really defines the purpose of the trial. We are trying to define whether using treatment X will make patients live longer, essentially, or something of that ilk. It includes, this protocol document includes the specific types of patients who will be included in the study, what the disease is, what the stage of the disease is, whether there are other entry criteria for entering the study, certain tests that have to meet certain criteria and the like. And this can be a long list of various yes and no criteria for entering the trial. It includes some statement of how many patients will be studied, so that you need to study enough patients so you can get an answer that is meaningful rather than just some anecdotal experience. And defining exactly how the new approach will be used. And this definition of this new approach, of how it's used, could be many, many, many pages long, because it has to specify exactly what the issues are in terms of how whatever you're doing is going to be done. And then how is the data going to be analyzed? It's not enough to say we're going to see what happens. There needs to be a very specific plan in terms of what will happen. And we will get into this a little bit more a little bit later in the talk. Next slide. Next slide, please. Low coming up. There it is. Okay. So what are some examples of possible clinical trials? Does a new drug, this is by no means exclusive, but one can be, does a new drug allow patients to live longer without the tumor growing? Does a new imaging study, an X-ray or an MRI study, detect the location of a tumor better than other tests? Is one standard operation better than another standard operation? And this could be things such as, does it cure more patients, or does it produce shorter hospital stays? It doesn't need to be something necessarily related to the tumor. Could ask a question whether a blood test allows a physician to detect a tumor recurrence earlier. Maybe asking a question that is what we call a toxicity question. How much of a new drug can be safely delivered, or how that drug should be delivered? Now, it might ask the question of whether a patient will benefit from a standard drug and to another standard treatment, such as radiation therapy, for example. Next slide. But there are some things that are not clinical trials. So if the physician says, let's try this new drug and see whether it works, whether your tumor goes away, that's not a clinical trial. Or I have this idea for a new operation that I tried out, and I'd like to do it on you because I think it might help. That's not a clinical trial. That's an anecdotal experience that is being generated. Or I don't know which of these two approaches is better, so we could just flip a coin and pick one of them. That's not a clinical trial because it is not an organized way to develop some specific information about those approaches. And it's important to realize this distinction of what is and what isn't a clinical trial. Next slide. Clinical trials in the United States need to be formally approved by a pre-arranged hospital reviewing group. It's usually called an institutional review board or an IRB. Some people change the names a little bit. But the IRB is formulated by the hospital, by the institution, and there actually are some national IRBs that include people with various levels of expertise. It includes lay individuals, not all are physicians or scientists, and they have specific rules of what they're looking for. And they look for the rationale for a study, including preliminary data. If you're going to expose patients to something new, you can't just do it willy-nilly. You have to have a reason for it that makes some sense. The safety of the approach is really paramount in many of these discussions. That doesn't mean the procedure is safe, but that careful attention is being paid to have the maximal safety. That includes even some studies where they're looking to define when patients get side effects and toxicity. They still do the best to try to keep it as safe as possible for the patients. And critically important, there has to be an appropriate informed consent. The patient needs to know exactly what is being proposed. They need to understand all of the issues related to that and then be able to give their intelligent agreement to do that. As I mentioned, this is a formal group, and nowadays protocols have to be centrally registered so that people, there were concerns in the past that people would run a lot of studies and like a drug company, and they would just forget about the ones that didn't work. And so you want all the studies that are started registered so there can be a good accounting for all of those. Next slide. Next slide, please. So a clinical trial has to do something to a patient, or at least to information about a patient. Sometimes it's just a matter of taking some blood and seeing what happens in the blood during treatment, but that is still something with patient material from a patient. And the procedures don't need to be new. If you plan to study them, then it must go through this formal protocol process. You can compare two old procedures, and that can be a clinical trial. It is not a clinical trial to do the procedures. It is a clinical trial to study them. Next slide. So I mentioned the informed consent, and I've mentioned many of these issues already. You must define what is being done, why it is being done, how it's being done, what are the likely or possible potential side effects, what are the alternatives, what, if any, are the potential benefits. You should understand clinical trials do not always have to propose a benefit to the patient who is entering the study. Some of them do, but some of them are simply trying to gain information from the patient. Protocols, these protocol documents and the informed consent can be very long and very confusing, even when they're written at an elementary level. And it's often mandated, and this is my personal opinion, that too much information be included in the informed consent document, which makes it very hard, even for a very intelligent individual, to truly understand what the factors are that go into that study. This is something that's argued a lot in many circles. Some people think that a smaller document that's short, that really addresses the most important issues are more important. Others think that a all-inclusive document is most important, and I suspect there's no true answer. But if you give someone a 20-page document, there's a fair chance they're not going to read it. Next slide. Just to mention, there are terms of confusion. The same word in the medical field can be used to mean different things. A study can be a test. I'm going to do a CT scan. I'm going to do a study on you. But a study can also be an investigation to learn about the test. A protocol, and I've used the term already, can be just the way physicians manage a patient. It's their approach. We have a protocol for treating this disease. We just have a manner in which we treat this disease. But a protocol can also be the formal document to describe how a clinical trial will be run. So they really are distinctions in terms of how these words are used. Next slide. So when should a clinical trial be performed? Well, first, the question being asked should be of clinical importance, or at least leading to a clinically important question. So it can be preliminary data, which will not give any critical information that will say that something should or should not be done, but it has to provide potentially important information leading in that direction, necessary information to develop something that's going to be better for a patient. And as I've mentioned already, it should be done with a major concern for patient safety. Not all clinical procedures are safe, but the patient needs to understand what the risks are, and they need to be done in the safest way possible. And sometimes a trial is done, as I said before, to define how to do the procedure safely. Which one of these is safer? And that's a legitimate approach in a clinical trial. And next slide. There should not be also another easy way to get the same information. If you're going to do, in essence, an experiment on a patient, that should not be the first thing you do. That should be the last thing you do, and you want to have other preliminary information. So if you're going to see whether an imaging study, a new imaging study is better than an old imaging study, you can first do some mock-ups in what are called phantoms, and just models of patients and see whether it looks like it's going to work. And then if that looks promising, then you can test it on real patients. If it's a new drug, it should have been tested in the laboratory on cells and in some animal models, usually on rodents, to see whether it appears that this approach has validity and is worth exposing patients to potential harm from this approach. And there should be a realistic chance of success. By no means does this mean a guarantee of success, but it does mean that from all the preliminary data you think, yeah, this really might work. Now, many clinical trials don't work, but there should be a realistic chance that it will. Next slide. So there are phases that you'll hear about all the time in terms of phases of clinical trials. And very simply, people talk about phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. And in a general sense, and there are details of this that we don't need to go into now, phase 1 is attempting to find out what dose of a new drug or whether a new procedure can be delivered safely to patients, and to try to learn the side of the new drug or procedure in patients. So one may have tested a new drug in animals and said, well, there's a risk of some damage to the liver, but you have to find that out whether that's true in patients. and starting in a way that's least likely to actually harm the patients. So you take information from the laboratory. The approach is used on a very few patients. Oftentimes, if it's a drug, the dose is slowly increased as patients are found to tolerate a lower dose. But you start at a very lower dose, which is probably not going to be effective against the tumor, but it'll be low enough that it's not likely to harm the patient. And then you escalate, and if you start seeing some harm, then you can pull back before you've really hurt patients. A phase 2 study takes the preliminary information from the phase 1 and asks the question of whether the new approach might work and to better understand side effects. So in the past, this was done by taking a new drug and using this drug alone in patients who have not responded to other treatments and say, are some of the patients look like they're getting a little bit better? And if it was, then you could move on. Next slide. So phase 3 is more the definitive test. This is where we're saying we have this new approach. It could be a diagnostic test. It can be a therapeutic test. And we're going to say, is this more effective? Or does it produce fewer side effects? Or whatever you think is a valid endpoint than what is thought to be the standard approach to whatever you're doing. And the standard is an area that can be of great confusion because not everyone agrees of what a standard should be. And there are oftentimes hours of discussion of what is standard. And they may have been approaches that have just been established by other clinical trials or in some other way has become accepted in the medical community as what most people or reasonable people would do for standard treatment. And phase 3 studies are usually randomized. They take the new test or the new approach, the old approach, and you flip a coin, in essence, by some office, not the physician who's doing the treatment, to determine what treatment or what approach will be used for an individual patient. Next slide. This next part is the new approach better, can be very confusing because you can use many different endpoints to try to define whether one approach is better than another approach. And these don't always match each other. So for instance, you can measure how long will patients live, a survival endpoint. Most people view this as the most definitive approach for cancer clinical trials. You can measure how long the patient will live without the tumor growing. That's something that's called progression-free survival. Point of fact, the fact that the patient lives longer without the tumor growing might not mean that the patient lives longer overall, and so you could question whether that is of great value to a patient. You can measure the patient's quality of life using questionnaires and the like, and use that as a measure. If the patient lives no longer but lives much better for much of the time, well, that's an advantage and something that's really of value. You can measure whether a diagnostic test finds a tumor earlier by using one approach versus another approach. But having a, quote, positive study does not mean that it is clinically important. And clinical importance is in the eye of the beholder. Next slide. So one example on this slide, I intentionally haven't put a lot of graphs in, is looking at overall survival as an endpoint. And this is what type of things physicians look at many times. You have one treatment in orange and one treatment in blue. And on the horizontal x-axis, you have time in months. And on the y and the vertical axis, you have the percent of survival. And you can draw a curve and see how many patients are alive, what percentage of the patients at any given time. And you say, okay, the orange line looks a little better than the other line. And you can measure a time at 0.5 when half the patients are alive and say, well, in this situation, it's 11.1 versus 13.8 months. So at that point, there's a 2.7-month advantage in survival. And so that looks encouraging, and there are other measures we use that I won't get into. There are hazard ratios and a lot of others, but this gives some idea of what you look at. You can draw similar curves for progression-free survival and a number of other endpoints. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. But there are still hard to determine whether something is better. There are many statistical tests that can be used to determine whether an approach is better. You'll always see some difference between two curves just by chance, because patients aren't exactly alike. And so you'll always see some difference. Is it a real difference? Is it due to the treatment? Or is the difference due from chance? And many, many times these are due to chance. But there are PhD dissertations and there are books written on how to do this best. So I mentioned differences commonly occur by chance. Differences also can occur because of subtle biases in terms of who gets entered onto a study. And it may be that overall the patients with one approach doesn't do better, but if you only enter this group, it looks like they do better. Seemingly minor changes in definitions of endpoints are measured could markedly affect the interpretation, and the medical literature is filled with examples of these. These problems that I just mentioned above are much more severe when comparing results with a new approach to patients who were treated in the past with an older approach. And that is why randomized trials are the gold standard, because they tend to minimize these various biases that come about if you just compare a new treatment that you're doing now to an old treatment that you did 5 years ago. Next slide. What biases might exist when studying a new treatment not in a randomized trials? Well, very commonly, and this is true for a lot of studies, people do non-randomized phase 2 trials. Well, oftentimes, the patients treated with the new treatment are healthier than the historical norm. Patients treated with the new treatment may have less advanced disease. Or they may have had extra special care because you're looking at this really carefully and you're watching out over these patients like a hawk, and the others are just patients who are treated randomly by standard approaches. And in fact, most of the time, patients who are first studied with a new approach are quite different than the average patient in that disease. And first results usually appear better than final results because of all these biases that exist. Next slide. And physicians argue whether a trial is truly positive. Is it really better? Is it better for the patient? And just to give a couple of examples, which treatment is better? One that makes an average patient live a little bit longer, but another treatment that cures more patients. So you have a few patients who live a really long time versus the average patient living a little bit longer. You tell me which is better. Which imaging study is better? One test that finds more tumors, what we call true positives, but it also calls many changes tumor when it is not, more false positives. And those false positives can lead to a lot of extra tests, a lot of extra treatment that's not valid. But each one of those could be viewed as better depending on how you look at it. Does finding a tumor earlier result in the patient living longer or feeling better? Or is it to just find it earlier? These are often questions that you need to ask in terms of whether something should become a standard treatment. Next slide. Which therapy is better if a new treatment cures more patients, but the new treatment also kills more patients because it is very toxic? And there have been very real examples of this in the past. Is a therapy better if it makes the average patient live 2 weeks longer, but the treatment is very expensive, and the patient may be hospitalized for 4 or 6 extra weeks? Is that of value to the patient, even if it makes the average patient live longer? Next slide. So all of these issues need to be taken into consideration when one is thinking about designing a clinical trial as a physician or as an investigator of any sort. And it's also very important for the patient to understand that these various very important subtleties exist. Having said that, despite all of these problems, clinical trials are the best means we have to find out the truth about things we do to patients. They are essential for advancing medical science, but the process is slow, and what is eventually called the truth is often a long time coming. And most importantly, the physician and the patient must still be the ones to judge whether a positive finding is a good approach for an individual patient. I think that's my last slide. And so any questions I'd be happy to take, or however you want to handle these.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tepper. I will now begin reading some of the questions that we received during your presentation. The first question that comes in is, should patients be afraid of clinical trials?
So I don't think patients should be afraid of clinical trials at all, because clinical trials often represent really excellent opportunities to get better treatment, have access to new approaches that may be of great value. But patients need to understand the clinical trial so they understand both the pluses and the minuses. So I'm a big fan of clinical trials, both from the physician side, and I think even as you look at a patient, it's oftentimes a very, very good thing. But you need to go into it with your eyes open and be aware of what the strengths are and what the potential pitfalls are.
Thank you. Are there ever clinical trials for cancer patients where one arm is a placebo?
So that doesn't very often happen in cancer, but it can happen in cancer. And the type of situation that would be appropriate is if there is no reasonable therapy for a patient given whatever the clinical situation is. And if the standard approach in that patient would be to say, we're not going to treat you, it might be reasonable to use a placebo as one of the arms, but the patient will know that one of the arms is a placebo. They just don't know which they get. And at times it's valid because people have demonstrated that placebos can have legitimate beneficial physiological effects. So it's not unreasonable, but it's in fact rarely used in cancer clinical trials.
Thank you. The last question is a two-part question regarding financials of clinical trials. The first part is, who funds clinical trials? And the second is, will clinical trials cost the patient any money?
So the first question cannot be answered precisely, but clinical trials can be funded by a variety of mechanisms. So the government, the National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, fund a whole series of clinical trials. They have a large program to do clinical trials. Drug companies fund many, many clinical trials. They develop a new drug, and they try to get clinicians in many hospitals around the country, around the world, to participate in these, and they are funded by the drug company. And what the drug company usually funds and what the NIH usually funds is the specific cost of the clinical trial itself, so that there are no added costs for the patient. There are also some studies that are run with single institutions, and again, these are usually designed so that there are no added costs to the patient. Sometimes it's hard to define what an added cost is, and most insurance companies do not like to pay this is complicated, but a lot of times insurance companies won't pay for clinical trial expenses. But you should ask, if someone is suggesting a clinical trial, what the costs are and what the insurance company would cost and what you would be liable for. And the second part of the question was what?
Would the clinical trial cost anything to the patient?
Oh, right. Well, so that's what you have to ask. In some situations, it could. It usually does not, but it could. And therefore, that's a question that would be appropriate to ask. Most informed consent documents actually address that issue, but I don't know if they all do.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Tepper. Thank you to all of our listeners today. Our next clinical trial webinar will be held on March 11th at 12 noon Eastern Time. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and thoughts before then. Please send your comments to patient.resource@debbiesdream.org. As you see on your screen, we have upcoming events to get involved in and support. Details about these events are available on the Debbie's Dream website at www.debbiesdream.org. Please stay on for our nutrition webinar. As you know, this webinar was brought to you by Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. Thank you to Debbie Zellman, President and Founder, our speaker, Dr. Joel Tepper from the University of North Carolina, and to Genentech for providing funding that helped make this webinar possible.